However, there are some problems with this view. I mean, one obvious objection is many philosophical issues clearly seem to go beyond just conceptual analysis. I mean, certainly many philosophers take themselves to be concerned with more than just concepts. Just consider a lot of work in metaphysics, like work on causality or essences, or metaphysical systems like modal realism. I mean, that's not just about concepts, right? These philosophers are talking about the world. Certainly, to say that philosophy can only tell us about the concept of goodness or the concept of truth or whatever, that does seem quite limited, really. That gives philosophy a very limited scope. I mean, after all, concepts in themselves aren't really very interesting, in many cases at least. So take the concept witch. No philosopher bothers analysing this concept because there are no witches. There's just no need to get clear about what the necessary and sufficient conditions are for witchhood, because nothing like witches actually exists. On the other hand, one of the reasons why we're interested in analysing the concept of causality is because we think that causality really is part, or at least potentially is part, of the structure of the world. And conceptual analysis is a tool for understanding what causality really is. I mean, perhaps one way to state this worry then is that to view philosophy as conceptual analysis, or to view the aim of philosophy as conceptual clarification, is to confuse a tool of philosophy with the aim of philosophy. Philosophers use conceptual analysis as a tool, right? But that doesn't entail that their subject matter, their aim, is concepts or conceptual clarification, right? We apply conceptual analysis as one method to understand causality. We're not just trying to understand the concept of causality. Similarly, astronomers use telescopes to probe the universe, but astronomy isn't about telescopes. Telescopes are just a tool of astronomy. So perhaps this view confuses a tool of philosophy with the aim of philosophy. A deeper problem with the conceptual clarification view is that concepts may simply not have the kind of structure required to support conceptual analysis. The method of conceptual analysis presupposes that concepts can be decomposed into constituent parts. So there are complex concepts which are composed out of simpler concepts. The concept bachelor is composed out of the concepts unmarried and man. This is known as the classical theory of concepts, but it's very controversial whether this theory is correct. A popular alternative is the prototype theory, which says that for some concept C, certain items are treated as being prototypes of C, and then other items fall under the concept C just in case they share a sufficient but vague number of properties with these prototypes. So basically, categorization involves similarity comparisons. It's not a matter of seeing like the necessary and sufficient conditions for application of a concept. It's what you're doing is you have a prototype and then you see whether other items are sufficiently similar to it. So in the case of bachelor, say, let's take the concept bachelor. The prototypical bachelor might be somebody like Hugh Hefner, say, at least before he was married. Whether another object counts as a bachelor depends on whether it is sufficiently similar to a Hugh Hefner type of person, with the relevant degree of similarity depending on contextual factors. It's not simply a matter of being an unmarried man. And the example that's sort of sometimes used here is, the Pope is an unmarried man, but is he a bachelor? That seems a little bit odd. Seems a bit odd to say that the Pope is a bachelor. Of course, we might try to fix the analysis of bachelor to exclude cases like the Pope. Perhaps, for example, a bachelor is an unmarried man who is not part of the clergy, or something like that. But if the prototype theory is correct, this is just a waste of time, because you're not going to find necessary and sufficient conditions for being a bachelor. And the same is true for any other concept. There will be intuitive counterexamples to any analysis that you propose, because concepts are not defined by necessary and sufficient conditions. It's rather a matter of similarity comparisons, and the degree of similarity that matters is dependent on the context. Now, I mean, look, there are other views in the psychology of concepts. I won't go into that in detail here. Suffice it to say, it's not just obvious that concepts have the kind of structure that conceptual analysis presupposes. So if you want to claim that philosophy is about conceptual analysis, then you're going to need to have a look at those debates about well, what exactly is a concept? How do concepts work? Now, a similar problem is, even if concepts have a classical structure, why exactly would it be up to philosophers to analyse concepts? I mean, surely, if concepts have a classical structure, surely the meaning or the definition of a concept is an empirical question. So, like, if I ask, what is the concept of free will? Well, this isn't something that can be answered by just sitting on an armchair and coming up with definitions and testing them against thought experiments. No, instead we'd have to conduct a survey. We'd have to go out and ask people for their views on free will. We'd have to try to elicit judgments that involve the concept of free will and see what role this concept plays. So this would involve a methodology more like linguistics or sociology. Okay, so let's have a look then at another view of philosophical progress. So another proposal is that progress in philosophy consists in the proliferation of theories. We might call this Feyerabенdian progress, after Paul Feyerabend, for reasons that will be obvious if you're familiar with his views. I've got a couple of videos in the Philosophy of Science series about Feyerabend if you're interested. Anyway, the idea of Feyerabendian progress is that the aim of philosophy is to develop a variety of different theories. Essentially, philosophy involves an exploration of theoretical possibilities. What positions can be held? What positions are at least logically possible? What positions are ultimately perhaps logically possible but implausible? What are the possible combinations of positions, in related areas? What are the connections between different positions? What we're trying to do in philosophy is build a kind of map of conceptual space, of the space of theories. And this means trying to generate as many different theories as possible and, working through the arguments and trying to see what the connections are. And this is something, of course, that many philosophers do. So philosophy can't tell you what the correct theory in a particular domain is. It can't say, for example, yes, we have free will and here's how it works, or, yes, there are objective moral values, and here's the epistemology of morality, etc. Philosophers will never converge on an answer to those kinds of questions. But philosophy, what it can do is it can kind of guide you to the interesting questions, and it can reveal the theoretical landscape. And this is one way of improving one's understanding of the domain in question. Notice that if this view of philosophical progress is correct, then convergence on a particular theory would actually be a bad thing. It would tend to impede progress. The whole point of philosophy, on this view, is to explore different theories. So people like Dietrich are trying to judge philosophical progress by the standards of scientific progress, but on this view, that's just totally illegitimate. Philosophy and science really are doing totally different things. We should never expect convergence in philosophy. It would be a bad thing if that happened. I mean, let's just consider briefly, or at least I'll try to be brief, a specific example here so you can see how this kind of view works. So, I mean, the area of philosophy that I think I'm most familiar with is the scientific realism debate. I have a whole series on this. So, if you don't know what scientific realism is all about, you can go and check out the introductory video. But basically, scientific realism is the view that our best scientific theories are approximately true and the unobservable entities and processes postulated by those theories really exist. So there really are electrons, black holes, genes, dark energy, and so on, in just the same sense that there really are everyday objects like trees, cars, and mountains. Anti-realists deny this. Anti-realists hold that we are not justified in believing that any scientific theory correctly describes the unobservable world. Now, anti-realism was, originally developed, well, at least back in the early 20th century. Most philosophers developed it as a theory of meaning. The simplest option here is what we could call a kind of crude instrumentalism, which is to say that claims about unobservables are simply meaningless. When a scientist says something like a charged particle has ionized fluid in the cloud chamber, this just doesn't mean anything. Such claims are simply tools for predicting and systematizing the behavior of observable phenomena. Obviously, the cloud chamber is observable, so statements about cloud chambers are perfectly meaningful, but charged particles and ionization, they're not observable. The crude instrumentalist would treat a claim like a charged particle as ionized fluid in the cloud chamber. A crude instrumentalist would treat that as being analogous to a flurble flax has plogrified the fluid in the cloud chamber, right? It just means nothing. Obviously, this kind of view is not especially popular because it entails that scientific theories have no content at all. But quite a popular view in the first half of the 20th century was logical positivism. For the positivists, all statements about unobservables and indeed observables should be translatable into statements about immediate sensory impressions. So to say a charged particle has ionized fluid in the cloud chamber, that can be translated to mean something like there is a white streak in the cloud chamber. And then maybe that can be translated further, just to refer to the immediate sensory data. So we'd end up with something like there is a white streak in the black box shape that appears translucent, or something like that. So again, scientific theories are not describing unobservable structures and processes in the world. Scientific theories are reducible in meaning to claims about sense impressions. Now, these kinds of views are no longer considered to be plausible, at least not as claims about how science works in general. But anti-realism hasn't been eliminated. Right? Instead, anti-realists have just tried to develop their view in different ways. A very important development was Van Frassen's constructive empiricism. So constructive empiricism explicitly repudiates any attempt to understand scientific theories in a non-literal manner. Constructive empiricism is not a theory about the meaning of scientific statements. The constructive empiricist is quite happy to say that a charged particle is ionized fluid in the cloud chamber. That's perfectly meaningful, and it means just what it says. We don't have to translate it into any statement about immediate sensory impressions or anything like that. It's just that there's no justification for believing it to be true. We can be agnostic about it. And so by turning away from the question of the meaning of scientific statements, Van Frassen gave new life to anti-realism. More recently, though, something like crude instrumentalism has been resurrected in a limited context by Darrell Rowbottom. Rowbottom's idea is that instrumentalism applies to scientific claims about properties that have no analogy with features of our own experience. So his idea is that, well, we can only think about the unobservable in terms of the observable. So it would be perfectly meaningful to attribute to a fundamental particle a certain length or mass, because we can observe length and mass. And just as I observe that 10 centimeters is smaller than 10 meters, I can imagine something having a length smaller than what I can see. I can imagine an object so small that I can't observe it. Similarly for very small masses. On the other hand, when scientists attribute, for example, color charges to quarks, that's meaningless. That's just a tool for making the theory issue the right predictions. Colour charge has no analogy in our own experience. Therefore, we can't really understand or comprehend what it even is, and so it makes no sense to ask whether statements about colour charge are true or false. Obviously, Rowbottom's instrumentalism is more limited than the sort of crude instrumentalism. But again, this is perhaps an interesting way to develop an anti-realist view. Now, okay, you might say, well, what's the right position here, realism or anti-realism? Well, obviously, philosophers haven't reached a consensus about that, but that's not the point. The point is to explore the space of theoretical possibilities. And here's just a simple sort of, map of theories that I've just quickly drew up with the important arguments shown in red. Perspectivism, pragmatism, and fine natural ontological attitude are positions that are sort of between realism and anti-realism, or at least they're supposed to be. Anyway, this map isn't really that... The details aren't that important, right? But the point for this video is, what's going on here is we propose a variety of theories, and we try as hard as we can to make each theory as strong as possible. Some views end up being eliminated. They end up just being shown to be implausible. So just, crude instrumentalism in its original form, okay, that's not going to work. Some views may have been made stronger. We can then try to revive the eliminated views in more limited or modified forms, as Rowbottom revived crude instrumentalism for only a specific class of scientific claims. And I guess one thing to notice here is, even though philosophers may not converge on one single answer, by engaging in arguments about which view of science is correct, we hopefully gain a deeper understanding of the nature of scientific knowledge. Most people, I think, are unreflectively realist. The common sense assumption is that, of course, we should believe what our best scientific theories tell us about the world. But I think that we have learned something interesting about the nature and function of science when we see that there are good reasons to doubt this, and what's more, we can alternatively view scientific theories as being more like powerful instruments rather than like true descriptions. That there are alternative ways of seeing science that are at least consistent and coherent. And if you consider your own favourite example of a philosophical debate, you'll probably be able to see how this view applies. So again, I was just thinking about utilitarianism, the theory that the right action is whatever maximises pleasure. Well, we then had the important development with Mill's proposal that there's a distinction between higher and lower pleasures, where higher pleasures involve more intellectual pleasures, like the pleasure of reading poetry or discovering new knowledge. Mill argued that utilitarians should focus on maximising higher pleasures. Other forms of utilitarianism can be generated by maximising things other than pleasure. In preference utilitarianism, we should act so as to fulfil the greatest number of preferences of the greatest number of people. Then there's the distinction between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. And the problem that rule utilitarianism collapses into act utilitarianism, which has forced rule utilitarians to develop their doctrine in a more sophisticated way. Again, you can see in this example how we are sort of feeling out and we're kind of mapping out the space of possible theories. So, we're generating all sorts of different theories and trying to proliferate theories, and that's where we have progress. So, hopefully that should give you some sense of how philosophical progress works on this kind of view. Now, one big question here, of course, is whether this kind of exploration of theoretical landscapes is really all that useful. Daniel Dennett has an article on, it's called Higher Order Truths About Chess. Now, we're all familiar with the game chess, and there are people who spend a lot of time working out just what is possible within the rules of chess. For example, Dennett says that there was quite a bit of surprise among the chess community when a computer discovered what's known as a mating net, which is a set of moves that leads to a guaranteed win. The computer discovered a mating net involving over 200 moves without a capture. It used to be that 50 moves without a capture by either side constituted a stalemate, as it was thought that at that point nobody could win. But this computer program disproved that. And so these kinds of truths about chess are quite interesting and important because, so many people play chess. But then Dennett considers another game called chess. Chess is exactly like chess, except that the king can move 2 squares in any direction, not just 1. There are just as many truths about chess as there are about chess, and it would require quite a lot of effort and ingenuity to discover the many truths about chess. But obviously there's no point. It just doesn't matter what the truths about chess are. If a group of academics were to start trying to work out all the truths of chess, we'd say they're wasting their time. And I mean, the concern is if we start to approach philosophy as just being about theoretical proliferation, as just being about trying to, let's just propose all sorts of different theories to try to map out what theories are logically possible, well, we're going to end up with the same kind of problem, right? If all we're doing is like developing and exploring all kinds of theories, surely most of this is just going to be useless. Most of this is just going to be like trying to figure out the truths of chess. Right then, a final view of the aim of philosophy is that philosophy acts essentially as a kind of incubator for new sciences. Philosophers deal with problems that are not yet open to empirical testing. And philosophical progress consists in the fact that eventually we should be able to understand these problems in such a way that we can apply empirical methods. Philosophy becomes science. Now, I mean, intuitively, this does seem to fit the history of intellectual inquiry. Historically, questions about, for example, the nature of space and time were dealt with by philosophers. It was Aristotle who was talking about space and time and motion and all that. But then these became the province of physics. Today, space and time are understood through general relativity. These are not really philosophical problems anymore. I mean, actually, there are still philosophers dealing with the philosophy of physics, problems related to space and time. But I think it's fair to say that questions about space and time are now largely answered by the sciences, right? That's kind of moved into the province of physics. Similarly, questions about the origin of mankind. I mean, that's not really philosophical at all. That's now just a matter of evolutionary biology. Or questions about the nature of the mind and the explanation of consciousness and emotion and reasoning. Yes, philosophy of mind is still a major area of research, but actually many questions about the mind have just, they've moved into psychology or other cognitive sciences. Now, many people who are negative about philosophy, like Lawrence Krauss and Lewis Wolpert, they would probably view this as being a case of like science steamrolling over philosophy, or science, invading philosophy and winning. But on the incubator view, what's really going on is that, well, it's just that philosophy is becoming a science, right? Once philosophers develop methods for answering certain big questions or basic questions conclusively, those questions move into the field of science. Philosophers work out the foundations and then it becomes a science. We can measure the progress of a particular philosophical field in terms of, I guess, how many sciences are born from it, or at least in terms of whether it has the potential to become a science. And notice that this explains why philosophy seems not to progress, because at any one time there will be no convergence on the questions of philosophy, because once the convergence is achieved, it isn't philosophy anymore. It's just science at that point. So, in fact, contra Dietrich, convergence does occur in philosophy. It's just that once the convergence happens, that's now considered to be a science, right? That's when science starts. So, when we consider the history of philosophy, we seem to see this litany of failures, whereas the history of science is full of success stories, often cumulative over time. But the sciences were born from philosophy. Physics, psychology, logic, these are all rooted historically in philosophy. So the philosophical work provides the grounding for science, and then that work gets classed retrospectively as science. And so it seems to be a success of science rather than a success of philosophy. And that's what creates the illusion of philosophical failure versus scientific success. So philosophy as an incubator for the sciences. So one of the problems with this view is it's questionable whether philosophy as we understand it has ever been an incubator for the sciences. And one thing to bear in mind here is that the term philosophy was once used much more kind of broadly, and the term scientist was only introduced in the 1800s. Before then, much of what we today call science was known as natural philosophy. So it's unsurprising that we can find many philosophers of the past whose work ended up laying the foundations of science. That's just because in the past no distinction was drawn between philosophy and science, and so many of those past philosophers also worked on what today we would call science. Daniel Stoljar, in his book on philosophical progress, points out that the key claim of the incubator view is that various questions that were once discussed in philosophy are now discussed by the sciences. But the question is, what does philosophy mean in this key claim? Suppose we follow modern usage and we treat philosophy as a discipline distinct from the sciences. Well, in that case, the key claim is false, because the questions were, from the start, scientific questions, right? They were not philosophical questions. When Aristotle asked about time and motion and species and so on, he was doing what we today would call science. When Descartes proposed theories of the emotions or anti-Newtonian theories of gravitation, he was doing what we would call science, because questions about time and motion and species and gravitation are scientific questions. And obviously it's unsurprising that later sciences were influenced by such inquiries. On the other hand, suppose we follow past usage and we don't draw a distinction between philosophy and science. Then again, on this view, the key claim is false, because the key claim assumes that there is a distinction. You can only say that philosophy becomes a science if there is a distinction between philosophy and science. I guess another way to look at this problem is philosophy as the discipline that we have today didn't really exist hundreds of years ago. Philosophy as an academic discipline, that involves a kind of international organisation, a network of professional researchers, peer-reviewed journals, university courses, which are focused on a particular subject matter with particular standards of evaluation. Right, that discipline only came into existence in, I guess, the late 1800s. And of course, the same is true for scientific disciplines, right? When physics as the discipline that we kind of know it today, that didn't exist until relatively recently. The division between the disciplines that we find today didn't exist in the past. So we can't really use historical evidence to show that philosophy becomes science, because that distinction wasn't there in the past. Another problem with the incubator view is that it can only be used to defend the value of past philosophy. Over the 20th century, philosophy doesn't seem to have acted as an incubator for science. Instead, new sciences are born from other earlier sciences. Just take astrobiology, which is concerned with the origins and distribution of life in the universe. Philosophers haven't really been involved in the development of astrobiology. Astrobiology is a young science, but if you pick up astrobiology textbooks or read histories of astrobiology, it doesn't seem to have involved any collaboration with philosophy. It's been born out of biochemistry, geology, exoplanetology, and so on. And astrobiology would be, I would have thought, a very good case for the incubator view. because there are all kinds of philosophical questions relating to extraterrestrial life. I'm still in the middle, really, of a series on the philosophy of SETI. But despite this, my impression is that astrobiologists don't really have much communication with philosophers. Or take a science like molecular biology, solid state physics, etc. In many cases, these sciences are born from other sciences or from technological developments. Philosophy has had very little role. Finally, another obvious problem with the incubator view is that even if it's right, it offers a very limited value for philosophy. Because on this view, philosophers never really make any contributions to knowledge. They're just preparing the groundwork. They're just waiting for something better to come along and take over. Philosophers never get at the facts. We don't really even produce any useful theoretical landscapes, as the previous view of philosophical progress suggested. Philosophy itself doesn't have any lasting achievements. It just prepares the ground for science to come along later. I think many of us come to philosophy because we want a richer understanding of the world and of our place in it. And on the incubator view, philosophy can't do that. So anyway, that's it. Those were some views of the aim of philosophy and of philosophical progress. Obviously, there are other possible views we might take here, but I think that's all for now. That's all I'm going to talk about anyway. So thanks for watching. Goodbye.